On June 17, 1902, as the railroad's noon whistle blew, horses, wagons, and buggies dashed to their predetermined spots to stake what they hoped would be their future. An 1898 treaty, which removed the middle third of the reservation, was finally ratified in 1900. 4 years later, President Theodore Roosevelt offered the ground to settlers under the Homestead Act. The train whistle blew, and in a cloud of dust they were off. The land rush race was a mad one. First, the homesteader had to drive a stake into the area in which he wished to live, and then dash to the land office in Blackfoot to pay a fee and file a claim. Frank Tyhee was one of those homesteaders. He had his eye on a spring located next to the railroad tracks north of Pocatello. One of the rules stated that it was illegal for any white man to be on the land prior to the noon whistle. Deciding that he didn't want to get beat, he paid a $5 gold piece to Indian friends to meet him about every 3 miles, so he could switch his tired horse for a rested one and continue his gallop to Blackfoot. He was second into Blackfoot and first to file because the small school teacher riding ahead of him couldn't get his horse to stop. Tyhee won the race, being the first to file his claim. Others would follow, and soon Tyhee Flats was divided into plots. Many townspeople saw the homestead ground as an opportunity to expand their fortunes, but most of them, after a time, ended up selling out. Tyhee eventually yielded her fruits to those who were seeking a new start and were willing to work hard and help each other succeed.
I think a thing that kind of caused some excitement about the Tyhee area was the farm ground and the potential of the Tyhee Flats, and so the family moved. They started coming here
back there to stake their claim, and that's how my granddad got the 160 acres there on Tyhee Road.
Henry and Caroline Jensen came from New Zealand in 1916. They came over in order to go to the temple. They landed, they were rich when they were left New Zealand. They were considered wealthy people there. When they came to the Americas, the rate of exchange of money, they were poor. They lost their money. They borrowed money from an uncle to come to Idaho. They had a few head of cattle. One winter, they ran out of feed for the cattle their first year. The cattle swam the river, and they all froze to death. Brother Gregerson from Pocatello met Dad. He told him about the ranch in Tyhee that was for sale, and they came to Pocatello. They were putting the water line in from Mink Creek to Pocatello. They were digging the ditch by a shovel, and they were paid by the foot, according to how fast they could dig. Dad was a big, strapping man, and he could dig faster than anyone else. And that's where he earned the money to make the down payment on the farm.
The Warrens came to Tyhee in 1930. And they had, through the years, 9 children. Mr. Warren died of an early death, and the oldest son, Amos, took the responsibility of guiding and directing the Warren family.
He came here because there was a tie plant. They made railroad ties for the railroad, and there weren't a lot of jobs around. He had been working on a ranch in Wyoming and came to Pocatello to work in the tie factory. And that would have been probably the late teens, early 20s, but they moved into Tyhee in 1923.
They moved down from Garfield, Idaho, up by Ashton. And crops just weren't doing too good up there. The seasons were shorter because it was colder. Snow stayed on the ground a whole lot longer, but down here in these lush, fertile flatlands of Tyhee, people were piling in here like crazy. So they moved down here. They moved all of their farm equipment and everything, and their cattle. They rented 2 big box cars from the railroad and loaded them up one day, and off they went. And showed up down here in Tyhee on Rio Vista Road and Siphon Road.
We were living in Pocatello. My father passed away in 1933. And after he passed away, my mother remarried another gentleman named Keiki. And we moved out to Tyhee to farm.
My parents were Hiram and Valencia Bilyeu. They moved here from Tonopah, Nevada in 1919, but in 1930, my dad went to Dan Church, who owned 160 acres at the corner of Chubbuck and Philbin, and asked if he could buy some of the land. Dan Church said, "I might as well tell you, I have lost everything except my house in town."
And they moved over here from Springfield, Idaho area, where they had been farming for 4 years, but it proved to be financially a disaster pretty much, and they had the opportunity to buy this store and come over here.
My grandparents first settled in the Pocatello, Tyhee area in the early 1900s. My grandfather, or my great-grandfather, was a widower, with several small children. My grandfather told me he was actually farmed out, as they used to do quite a little bit, to make a little bit extra money for the family.
Dad Tanabe had a benefactor friend in Japan, and he said to Dad Tanabe, "You go to America and make some of it yourself." So he came, and he did. He was successful, and his benefactor says, the kept correspondent, he says, "Are you married?" "No." "Well, how old are you?" "35. He says, "You ought to be getting married." "Well, find me a woman and I'll marry her." He didn't. "Okay, I'll do that. I know where there's a good girl." And I don't remember, some southern part of Japan. And I recommend her to you. I'll send her, you send the fare, and she'll land in Seattle on such and such a day, on such a ship, you know. So he went up to Seattle, and he met this bride-to-be. Well, come forth, went to the Justice of Peace and got married, and then they drove. Then they come by train to Tyhee, or to Fort Hall. That's where Dad Tanabe was from. Fall of '34, through a mutual family friend, we heard of Tanabe was looking for a young Nisei, second generation Japanese. It's called Nisei. That he could assist to further his education and do what he could to help him, because he owed this debt to his benefactor, whom he got his start in life, and this benefactor says, "Now you find somebody and you give him the same chance." So that's how it started.
I think there were builders, there were contributors, there were people who were willing to go without so that their family could have the blessings of life.
Hard work was the norm for those who settled Tyhee. They worked from sunup to sundown, and for many, young children were a part of that workforce.
And so they came to the area first. They tended to be courageous people that had a lot of intestinal fortitude and were willing to live without a lot of the comforts of life.
We spent our growing up time in
Tyhee, and we were taught how to work. Mother and Daddy worked hard. They set the example for all of us. Dad was not only a janitor of the Tyhee school for 32 years, he had a little 20-acre farm that he tried to farm, and us kids were taught how to work on this little 20-acre farm. We had a few animals, and as soon as we could, we worked for our neighbors. I myself started working for McMinn Dairy when I was, I think it's 11 years old, milking 120 or 130 cows every night and morning.
They would gather all the sagebrush together, they'd work all day, they'd put it in big piles, and then at nighttime they would burn it all. And so all of this land was just covered with sagebrush, and all of my great-grandfather's kids and the boys and everything really worked hard on cleaning up the area with sagebrush and developing it, and they were involved in the homesteading of this area.
And I worked with Smut Warren. Not only did we thin beets, or top beets, we thinned them, and it was really a good money maker for us.
Grandfather farmed and had a herd of dairy cows. I remember him filling 10-gallon milk cans each morning with milk and setting them out to be picked up by the creamery, and then I remember going to town with them on the weekends for them to pick up their milk check.
He worked on the farm for Dr. Howard, and his family took care of all of the needs out here. He was the sexton of the Pocatello Cemetery before that, and he told stories, my grandfather did, about taking the kids out there and playing as he worked in the cemetery. And one of the stories that was always passed on was that he planted all the big trees along Fifth Avenue and the cemeteries.
They were one of the first residents of this, and he had this truck farm, and in those days they didn't have refrigeration, so he furnished the green stuff for Pocatello up to West Yellowstone.
He raised that family of 5 kids on 80 acres, farming it, and that was before the days of the big tractors. Yeah, I can remember him using horses.
Grandpa first got here, and I mean, he really didn't have anything, and he still had children at home. He was 56 years old, and he was broke, except he had 20 acres. And he started to milk cows and sold the milk to other home delivery dairies. And he determined, along with my father, that they could make more money if they started bottling the milk and selling it to people. And so my grandfather went out and started developing the customer base. And he and Daddy also milked the cows and bottled the milk, and then they delivered it.
Wow. And there were 25 dairies here at that time.
When they started.
25.
25 licensed home delivery dairies when they started in 1939.
Dad took over and ran the dairy from my grandpa when my grandpa retired, and Dad milked cows and processed milk until 1962 when he sold the cows. And the story that he's told me for the rest of his life was he thought he was on a vacation for 2 years after.
In those days, there wasn't a lot of government assistance or a lot of help. You depended on your neighbors, on your family, on your board members, and anybody else who would help, and that was the way they grew up.
Work was a major part of everyone's life in Tyhee, but it wasn't the only part of their lives. When tragedy happened, people found time to offer a hand to their neighbors.
What happened was the tractor exploded and my dad started on fire. And you know how they tell kids that you should drop and roll. Well, when you roll in stubble, it follows you. And so he knew that, and he fell to his knees and he said, "God help me." And he said he looked down and there wasn't even a spark left on his body. It was totally gone. And I do believe that the Lord saved him. He had a long road of healing. And it happened at a really bad time of the year when the harvest, the sugar beets, and the hay needed to be brought in. And the ward called for a George Facer Day. And I remember all these great big farm equipment pulling into the yard. And all these farmers coming in with the potato toppers and the beet diggers and everything that they had, and they just set to work that day. And I remember the Relief Society coming and setting up tables out in the yard and to feed all those farmers that day. But it was quite an amazing time. And there would be people that would just show up and help my brothers turn the water in the field. And the farmers would just turn up and help, and then they'd go home and take care of their own stuff. And they made sure that our family got in the crops that year, that we got a good price on stuff, and that the farm didn't fail. And without them, our family wouldn't have made it.
Glenn rose out of bed quickly, going into the bed, saying, "Mom, Mom, the house is on fire." Everybody in the community came, brought clothing, food, all the necessities, and then there was no place to call home, and a lot of the neighbors took children in and cared for them and fed them and gave them places to stay and sleep. And then the community of Tyhee, with their fellowshipping and their closeness together, they joined together with shovels and picks and horses and scrapers, and they dug a basement, a hole for a basement, and by hand they formed the foundation and mixed the concrete to form the basement walls right there on that same property.
My name is Maureen Empey Holt. The Empey family came to Tyhee in the 1930s. In 1949, my grandfather, Ira Empey, was killed in a farming accident in Tyhee. He was baling hay for neighbors, and he got his arm caught in the baler, and that was how he was killed.
A sense of unity seemed to be a particular characteristic of the community. Not only did they help each other in times of trouble, but they also played together and socialized together. The school bus, dances at the church, baseball, the Grange, 4-H, work, and other activities brought them together.
And the people interacted a lot more because they would haul the sugar beets to the beet dump on Decay Road down by the railroad tracks.
They used to trade for work all the time. Dad had a thrash machine, and he thrashed for all the neighbors.
The farmers would be doing the threshing of their wheat. They would all get together and move from farm to farm and work together as a crew. And whoever was the wife of the fields they were working in, then that wife had to fix the noon meal for them, and it was always a very big meal. And she would say sometimes, you know, if things got carried away, this is just like feeding the threshers.
Back in the old days, when people went on a mission, it was a big deal. And everybody really supported that person. And Maple Hill was one of the very, very few in the Tyhee area that went on a mission back then. It was inspiration for the whole Tyhee area.
I had a great growing up years in Tyhee. It was absolutely the best place in the world to grow up. But we also had to mind our manners, because if we did something wrong, we could also get get a whipping if we deserved it too, whether it be Floyd Ward or Nolan Davis or whatever the case may be. So that's just the way it was in Tyhee. We just were all friends, and we were all kind of part of one big family.
Played, but everybody in Tyhee was friends. And of course the church was the big entertainment place because we didn't go clear to Pocatello very often because that was too far and too expensive. They had movies once in a while, and we had never seen a movie before. And at the end of it, you could hear the flop of the film. You wanted to play with somebody, you walked a couple of miles to their house and played.
Our activities were homegrown. Everything we did was make-up stuff that we did, and baseball was one of our prime games.
The cars would line up facing the baseball field, all along the third base line, out to third base, and out to first base line, out to first base. Whenever anybody hit a baseball, a good hit like a home run, all you could hear all over the Tyhee flat, "Ooga! Ooga!"
Learned to swim in the canal that went past our house, and built boats and floated up and down the canal. Learned to water ski in the canal, as a matter of fact. Till my friend Gary Steed drove his car off into the ditch, and that kind of is water skiing.
Many times when the watermelon was on, he would bring home enough watermelon for the whole community to come and have a watermelon fest on our lawn.
We would all make rubber guns, and the guns were made out of wood with a handle and a barrel, and on the back of the handle was a clothespin that we'd nail on there. And then we'd cut bands out of an inner tube and stretch from the clothesline to the end of the rubber gun. And so when you shot it, you just opened the clothespin, the rubber gun, the rubber band shot out, and if you hit somebody, why, you'd scored a hit.
Well, that was our clubhouse, and our fort,
And our battleship.
and we just had a lot of fun playing in that old boxcar.
Anyway, coming out of Nebraska where we lived, we walked to school 3 miles to school. We got out here and there were school buses running, and so we got to ride the school bus, and that's where I happened to run into this lady here. She was the loudest little thing on the school bus.
And that school bus trip was about an hour and 15 or 20 minutes, pretty cold. So the school bus came around and picked me up and then went right up to the edge of Fort Hall, where the big school is. It went around there, turned around, came back to Tyhee, and let us off.
My mother ran the Grange. She would collect vegetables in the fall and enter them in the fair up in Pocatello and Blackfoot Fair. And the Grange, that was a big social function for them. They'd go out gathering up vegetables and then wash them, clean them up, and haul them up there and enter them in the state fair.
In the 4-H club out there, I was president of the 4-H club. Been there for about 15 years, 10 or 15 years. Go to Downey and to Lava, to the fairs in Pocatello and to Blackfoot.
Tyhee began to grow, and people began to enjoy the tranquility that comes from a steady series of events.
I remember the Niter and Bringhurst stores, the penny candy, the school and church festivals. Tyhee was a wonderful place to grow up. Those were the carefree and safe years where a kid could roam the foothills, ride your bike, and run carefree without your parents having to worry about strangers.
So until then, they lived in a little 2-room house.
That no longer exists. Or
That, with an outdoor toilet. So when we moved in this house, we thought we were moving into luxury. 2 bedrooms, a bathroom with a flush toilet, and a carpet and a telephone.
Bread and milk was a good good substantial meal in the summer with radishes and cheese and onions, green onions. And when I would go over and have supper with my grandma, she'd let me put sugar on my bread.
Situation out on the flat, as we called it, was not an easy place to live because we didn't have electricity and we didn't have plumbing. But we did, after about a year, we carried our water from a spring that was down below a little hill near our house. We carried that up in big milk gallons, milk cans for the first year we lived there by kerosene lamp. That was all we had. But they put in what they called a Delco system. So we had a whole bunch of batteries downstairs in our basement which generated electricity, so we actually had electricity.
Tyhee's tranquility would be interrupted by the Great Depression. However, for the most part, members of the Tyhee community weathered the struggle quite well. There was plenty to eat from the gardens they grew, and although it took some ingenuity to live well, many had already experienced hard times and knew how to make do until better times prevailed.
She made over clothes. We had a lot of rich relatives, luckily enough, during the Depression, and they'd give her their old old dresses. She would unpick them and clean the material in gasoline and hang that on the line to air. She would make our coats and our dresses from that material. So we were always dressed well during the Depression. My dad raised a humongous garden, and he always raised beef. So we always had food during the Depression. We never suffered for want. Us as kids didn't even know we were in a depression.
I think that we had a wonderful growing up, even though the Depression was on. And I know that my folks were very concerned about how things were going, and but we never had a problem with stuff to eat because we grew everything we ate almost.
It's told that after the Depression, my grandfather had lost the farm up there. They didn't have anywhere to live. And so they moved into a boxcar that was located over next to Aunt Edna's place. They lived there one summer. They also lived in a chicken coop until they could get the money and the resources together to try and build another home.
The community would not fare quite as well during World War II. The effects of the war were deep. Many lives were changed forever. Young boys signed up to be in the military, others were drafted. At least 118 served during that time. 7 never came home again.
A bunch of younger men that wanted to go into the service. And there was Melvin Davis, Leon Lewis, and Norris Warren, and some of the others that was there. There was 2 Barrett brothers that lived on Tyhee Road. They was drafted along with Nolan Davis. And then, but they went to the different branches of the service when they was drafted.
During World War II, the 3 younger brothers were all in the war.
Japanese neighbors would experience restrictions imposed upon them by the United States government. Many neighbors reached out to them, some did not. It was a time of uncertainty.
When the World War II, on Pearl Harbor Day, these guys were all eligible for the age-wise for the military. Out of the 6 boys, 5 were drafted. And that one stayed to take care of the farm and to support his family. So he was exempt for that reason.
I remember December 7th, 1941 very clearly. I was in the 7th grade going to junior high school in Pocatello. And found out what happened on that Sunday. Going to school the next day was very apprehensive. I didn't know what was going to go on. But we caught the school bus, went to school. And I always remember, and I was grateful to the principal. The principal was a Dan W. Martin. And that very morning, 10 o'clock in the morning, he called an all-school assembly. And he told the students what was going on. But he says, these children, there was about 6 of us, Japanese Americans in Irving. And he told us that we didn't have anything to do with it. So that, and the way he explained it, there was no racial animosity or anything. I'm always grateful for that.
Nakashimas lived here. They had 3 sons and 2 or 3 daughters. And when the war started, they had not just them, all of the Japanese here had to turn in flashlights, cameras, guns. They couldn't own any of those things. And what was your friend's name? Rido? Rido Nakashima had a .22 single-shot rifle, and for a young boy then to have a .22 single-shot, that was a wonderful thing to have. He didn't want to give it to the sheriff, so he took it down and gave it to Floyd. A number of years later, I don't know, about late 1980s, we had a reunion, the Tyhee school did, and 2 Nakashima girls came. And afterwards, we invited them up to roam this property where Floyd and I have lived for so long. It's where they spent some years growing up. We said to roam it, and Floyd tried to give them back their brothers, 22, and the 2 brothers had died over in Italy in the war, and but they didn't want to take them back.
Some of our super patriots became night riders. You know what a night rider is? They ride around and boom, 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 boom. That's what they did. They went up to Decay's after dark, and the Decay had some houses there that housed his Japanese laborers. Bang, 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 right into the house. Then they left there and they come by. I remember they come by our place and shouted some epithets and stuff. Well, they passed and went over to your master's, and they shot into their home, really. And one of the bullets hit the kitchen sink and fell on the floor. But they didn't know that they were shooting rifles until the next morning, when they found this 30 caliber rifle bullet by the sink, and it had gone through 3 walls, over a bed in the bedroom, and didn't hit anybody, and dropped, and that's how. So they knew there was a high part.
For the first time in history, the government brought in people from Mexico to help on the farms, making up for the depleted workforce.
About the Bring Her store that used to be at the corner of Yellowstone and Tyhee. It was also a labor complex, and originally there was about 15 or 20 little cabins. One cabin still remains down there that laid down there, and they took care of the labor in World War II. Also, we're at the Tyhee store on the other side. There was a labor camp in here prior to the trailer houses and stuff that was in there. There was also some cabins in there for the same thing. And that's where the government made an agreement with Mexico during World War II, where Mexico was neutral, and the men were gone, and so there was nobody left in the valley, anywhere in the country, really. So the United States made an agreement with Mexico to bring in Mexican labor voluntarily. But the government had to make sure there was housing, and so hence these labor camps sprung up around here, and that's where the farmers had to pay to keep them as well. That's where they had to come and pick them up and take them to the fields to work. And that's how those labor camps got started. And then later on after the war, they were dispersed, and that's why we have Mexican labor in our country today.
German prisoners of war were also used to help work the fields.
The Fort Hall boarding school closed in 1936. In the war, in 1940, the United States military stepped into the boarding school up there and made that the prison for the German war prisoners. They in turn also voluntarily went into the fields with armed guards all over Tyhee.
During World War II, there was a German prison camp, a camp of German prisoners at Fort Hall. They had been captured in North Africa, and the government had brought them back to the United States. And they worked in some of the various farms around. And we had a group of German prisoners, and they were thinning beets.
Eckert needed a job, and I really liked Eckert. And I was working part-time at night at Eddie's Bakery. And I told my boss about him, and he had told me to have Eckert come apply. And they hired him. They liked him.
Tyhee is not a town or a county. It is an area that a group of people with common values and goals called home. Pat Tyhee lived somewhere in the vicinity of where the railroad's trains stop. It is purported that is why they called the stop Tyhee. Supplies were dropped there, and potatoes, beets, and livestock were shipped out.
This is where the community in the olden days, in the 20s and 30s and the 40s and the 50s, brought in their goods and supplies, fertilizer, coal for the furnaces in the homes, seed, and other supplies brought in by the Portneuf Grange. This is where the people brought their supplies in. There was no other supply location to bring it. They brought it in here to get it cheaper. They joined together to bring it here.
For a farmer, making sure your crops have enough water to grow is always a top priority. Water systems changed little by little. At the time of the land race, Tyhee was dry farmed. Then the Briscoes dug a well, which meant the farm wasn't dependent upon the rain for moisture. Flood irrigating became the means of getting water to the crops. A canal system was built, expanded, and improved over time. Henry Jensen, who had dug some of the original canals from Mink Creek to Pocatello, tried the first sprinkler pipes. They caught on quick, which meant less time flood irrigating. In 1936, an extensive canal system was begun, eventually being finished in 1942.
I'm guessing that my granddad came down there in the late 20s. I know he paid the $6.50 fee to get the water, and then he paid in 1930 something. When they built the equalizer, he paid $30-some more an acre for that project. Yet everything was gravity irrigated. You just took it out of the ditch and ran it down little furrows through the field. And that was a 24-hour day job. And one guy could farm maybe 80 acres.
And people like her father, George Facer, could make water move in ways that would seem that it was going uphill. And one way I describe that is like visualizing how you sail a sailboat against the wind. Well, they could make the water flow somewhat against gravity, but basically they used rows to make the water flow in the right direction.
So after the canal system came in, one of the first canals they put in was the Tyhee Wasteway. And it ran from Chubbuck, and you've noticed it starts up by George Zazau's house. It runs all the way into the American Falls Reservoir to drain this valley, because there was no drain. After they got the drain established, they put in the Yellowstone Highway.
In 1925, I believe it was, is when they built the Yellowstone Avenue as a highway, and that's what connected all the way from Income to Idaho Falls.
In 1917, Alfred Emil and Edith Pedersen were some of the first farmers in Tyhee, purchasing the uncleared 160 acres on the corner of Wallen and Rio Vista Road. Grandpa specifically chose that acreage to farm because he could view the saddle of the East Bench Hills.
Another aspect of living in Tyhee was living adjacent to the Fort Hall Reservation. For many, the combining of cultures brought new experiences and new friendships. For some, it was not so positive. Looking back, we take note of those who chose to befriend each other because they benefited from the richness that comes through friendship.
The Shoshone-Bannock tribal people had a special relationship with the Pedersons, often dropping by for a cup of coffee, a sandwich, a ride to or from town, or a tool Al might have. In fact, many people came to use or borrow tools. Both Alfred E. and son helped repair machinery for anyone who asked. Edith, our grandmother, advocated for Native Americans to receive schooling at Tyhee, and also worked to get Tyhee incorporated into the Pocatello School District.
So there were Indians part of the way, and then there were white people in part of the area. Because Dad had worked on the reservation, all the Indians were his friends. They were, he just knew them all. And in fact, on Thanksgiving, we could be pretty sure that maybe a couple of families would show up at our house for Thanksgiving dinner. It was just also, as a livestock manager on the Fort Hall Reservation, the Indians had 10,000 head of cattle, and he came in and helped upgrade their cattle stock, and he worked there for a few years. After that, he was a deputy sheriff on the reservation for a short period of time. Mother continued to work as a nurse out on the reservation. In fact, she was the only nurse out there for about 10 years.
With a better canal system, Tyhee prospered. Beets, potatoes, and wheat, as well as livestock and gardens with all kinds of vegetables, were part of Tyhee life. Eventually, Tyhee would boast 2 stores with gas stations, a fairground, an airport, a school, a church, and 25 dairies. Life continued for the Tyhee residents, who experienced both ups and downs. The closing of the U&I Sugar Company affected many area farmers. Some sold ground, and small neighborhoods began to spring up, bringing many more people into the Tyhee area.
Farmers couldn't retool to buy different machinery to raise different crops, and so it literally destroyed the farming industry, and hence farms were sold. That's how housing in the community started up. Paradise Subdivision was one, Lacey Acres, Moonglow, up on the bench, 2.5 Mile Road, another one, the Briscoe Farm, another one. They fell to the wayside because of the lack of business possibilities for agriculture. It hurt them. And so it's not, I don't know how to approach it. It's not negative, it's not positive, but it is a fact of history.
Although the old days are gone, some relics still mark the area. They are evidence of days gone by.
The old boxcar over here is an original boxcar, probably out in the 1930s. It was used to store goods and services from the Portland of Grange that was delivered in here for coal, seed, fertilizer, household items, even furniture. And that's where the Grange stored their stuff. They'd unload it off the cars that came in here. They would be cited. And then after that, the Utah-Idaho Sugar Company stepped in and bought it. They also used it for storage for seeds. From the Utah-Idaho Sugar Company, that was used from about 1936 to 1970 to scale and unload the sugar beets here at the siding, at the Tyhee siding. Over there is the cables that the original puller was used to pull the cars through to load the sugar beets on the tracks so that we could take them to market. When the puller was broke down, we used that cable, we'd tie it onto the back of trucks, our own farm trucks, and pull the train cars ourselves to move them forward, to get them out of the way so we could load other cars. So we're standing down here at Al Pederson's farm. This building, as I know it, was the original horse barn at the Tyhee School in 1919. And it housed the horses from the kids coming to school, as well as the buses and the horse-drawn bus.
The trees there, the big grove of trees, were planted in 1914. Stewart had planted them for Dan Church, and he said the rows were different because he wanted to be able to drive his car, his Ford, back and forth between the rows of trees.
Tyhee isn't the same as it used to be. The old days are gone. Some things have changed, and some things haven't. People have died or moved away, and others have stayed, giving way to the next generation and the next. No matter what the passing of time has brought, there is one thing for certain. Tyhee lives in the hearts and minds of the many who called it home.
They came here in the early 20s, and we've lived here ever since.
Seeing how much people were willing to take upon themselves other people's burdens, I decided that I wanted our children to learn that. The best place for them to learn it was from the people here in Tyhee. So I've always been grateful to the many people who were here before that I grew up with years and years ago, because they taught my family the same thing.
I love those dear hearts and gentle people who live in my hometown, because those dear hearts and gentle people will never ever let you down. They read the good book from Friday till Monday. That's how the weekend goes. How it goes. I've got a dream house I'll build there one day, with picket fence and rambling rose. I feel so welcome each time that I return, that my happy heart keeps laughing like a clown. I love those dear hearts and gentle people who live and love in my hometown. They read the good book from Friday till Monday. That's how the weekend goes. I've got a dream house I'll build there one day, with picket fence and rambling rose. I feel so welcome each time that I return, that my happy heart keeps laughing like a clown. Like a clown. I love those dear hearts and gentle people who live and love in my hometown. In my hometown. Those dear hearts and gentle people